I believe I've seriously harmed my husband's job and created problems for him at work. I take full responsibility for my actions, and it's undoubtedly the biggest mistake I've ever made. I cheated on my husband, giving in to a relentless temptation that kept coming my way. They say that finding a wife is a blessing, but I fear I've been far from a good discovery for my husband. I'm convinced he must harbor strong resentment towards me right now, and hate might even be an understatement. I can't even bring myself to face my parents at this point. What can I possibly tell them? I've cheated on my husband, potentially jeopardizing his career and livelihood. There's no way my parents would ever accept me back after this. My husband didn't simply seek revenge, he completely shattered me emotionally and ensured that I regretted my unfaithfulness. He didn't let me off the hook in any way, leaving no stone unturned. It's only now sinking in just how much I've been through, and it's mind-boggling. But I can't deny that all the pain I'm feeling is the result of the grave mistakes I've made. I'm Faith, a 24-year-old entrepreneur, and I've been married to my husband, Leonard, for the past 2 years. We dated for 2 years before tying the knot. I met Leonard when I was 20 and is considerably older at 27. He works as a banker and is exceptionally intelligent and diligent in his job. I can't help but boast about his work ethic. That's why the consequences of my actions are hitting me so hard now. I've come to realize that cheating on him is the greatest mistake I've ever made. I didn't cheat on Leonard accidentally. I'd be lying if I said it was an accident. I know exactly how it all unfolded, and that's why I'm filled with self-disgust right now. Often, people knowingly do things and then regret them later, and I'm no different. That's why I've decided to share this significant mistake with everyone. Throughout the 2 years of my marriage to Leonard, we've remained true to ourselves. We never let our work interfere with our relationship, always supporting each other. In fact, I had never met Leonard's boss until a few months ago. Despite visiting his workplace a couple of times, he never introduced me to anyone there. I can't be the only one who's unfamiliar with everyone at their spouse's workplace, right? 7 months ago, Leonard received an invitation to his bank's year-end party and asked me to be his +1. I eagerly accepted because I never wanted to miss an opportunity to support him. Little did I know that this seemingly innocent party would spell disaster for my marriage. If I had known, I would have never attended. Leonard even bought me a lovely dress and a pair of shoes for the occasion, as the party's color theme was wine and I didn't have anything suitable in that color. My sister, an emerging makeup artist, helped me with my makeup that night. I'd love to give her a shout-out, but I want to keep our identities as private as possible. When Leonard and I arrived at the party, it was an overwhelming experience. I never anticipated a year-end party hosted by a bank to be as lavish as the one we attended. The atmosphere was pleasant, and Leonard wanted to introduce me properly to his colleagues. Previously, I'd only occasionally visited his workplace, casually greeting anyone I happened to encounter. At the time, I was eager to meet his colleagues since Leonard had shared so much about them. He introduced me to his friends first, and they were friendly and welcoming. Many of them praised my husband's intelligence, and I felt like a proud wife because they were absolutely right. Before Leonard could introduce me to his boss had to attend to something and left. Leonard and I spent our time sampling cocktails and enjoying the delicious food. I even forgot about the person my husband had wanted me to meet. However, later in the party, his boss approached us and apologized for not being able to talk earlier. We didn't mind at all. Before I continue, I should clarify that my husband's boss is not one of the bank's owners. He's the head of the department where my husband works. His name is Raphael and is 30 years old. When my husband introduced us, I didn't think much of it and didn't pay him much attention. I did notice that he held my hand a bit longer than usual, but that was the only unusual thing I observed. He didn't stay with us for long before leaving. My husband often talked about his colleagues, but he never really boasted about his boss, so I assumed they didn't have a close relationship outside of work. We continued to enjoy the evening, and I didn't see Raphael again. Honestly, I even forgot that I had met him at the party. That party turned out to be incredibly insignificant, and that's not an exaggeration. Nothing remarkable happened that night. The real drama unfolded weeks after our initial encounter with him. After the party, Leonard and I returned home and discussed everything that had occurred at the event, our typical post-event routine. Days after the event, I completely forgot about the meeting and the party itself. Life resumed its usual course, and I dedicated my attention to my business endeavors. As an entrepreneur, I'm always eager to explore new business ideas. I find satisfaction in earning money and engaging in productive activities. One of my most significant business ventures is co-owning a salon with my best friend. One day, I had an unexpected visitor. By now, you might have guessed who it was. Raphael paid a visit to the salon. Initially, I didn't even notice or recognize him. I was occupied with attending to a customer. However, my best friend approached me and mentioned that we had a customer who claimed to know me. Intrigued, I decided to find out who she was referring to. To my astonishment, I saw Raphael, my husband's boss, standing there with the young lady. It caught me off guard, and I had to take a second look because I couldn't believe my eyes. He reintroduced himself and asked if I remembered him. I confirmed that I did, and that's when he requested a moment of my time. I didn't know how to react because it felt awkward to interact with my husband's boss without him being present. The situation was even more uncomfortable considering we had only met once before. When he took me aside for a conversation, he explained that someone had recommended my salon to him. I was puzzled about how he had suddenly received such a recommendation and how he knew that I was the owner. My curiosity got the better of me, and I inquired about the person who had directed him to my salon. He simply mentioned that he had heard about it from my husband, who often spoke of my ownership of the salon. To be honest, the entire conversation felt awkward because I didn't quite know how to address the situation with Raphael. Following our awkward conversation and his emphasis on the importance of business, he informed me that the young lady accompanying him was his niece and she needed to have her hair done. He explained that he had been searching for a salon where he knew someone, ensuring that his niece would stay and get her hair done. According to him, she had a tendency to be rebellious and run away when left alone at places. That's why he chose to bring her to my salon upon discovering that I owned one. While I found his explanation somewhat unusual, I saw no issue with looking after a teenager and agreed to ensure she stayed until he returned to pick her up after work. That was the arrangement we settled on. Before he departed, my best friend attended to his niece's hair while I resumed working on the customer I had been serving earlier. Just 4 hours later, he returned to collect his niece, expressing gratitude. I found his gratitude somewhat unexpected since allowing someone to stay at the salon for that duration was a common occurrence. Nevertheless, I accepted his thanks and downplayed the situation as a mere coincidence. I didn't want to dwell on it because it seemed insignificant. My best friend and I even felt pleased, thinking our salon was gaining popularity. Little did I know that what I perceived as a coincidence was far from coincidental. Upon returning home that day, I contemplated whether to share the incident with my husband. It didn't seem like a big deal, as the salon always had customers coming and going. I debated whether it was necessary to inform my husband. After some reflection, I decided it might be best to tell him, allowing him to extend his thanks to his boss. I wanted to express my gratitude for his patronage, so I disclosed the incident to my husband. However, he didn't view it as a significant matter either. He explained that he had mentioned my ownership of the salon at work multiple times, speculating that this might have prompted his boss to become a customer. He agreed to convey my gratitude on my behalf, and that was the end of it. Life continued, and I went back to focusing on my business as usual. However, 2 weeks later, Raphael paid me another unexpected visit, accompanied by his niece once more. This time, he expressed his intention to have her hair washed. I thanked him for returning and proceeded to wash his niece's hair as requested. Unlike the previous visit, he stayed until the hair washing was completed. I didn't anticipate him remaining throughout the entire process, assuming he had to go to work. While I was curious, I refrained from asking, respecting his privacy and maintaining a formal demeanor due to his position as my husband's boss. After finishing the hair wash, I declined to accept payment as his niece's hair wasn't particularly dirty and it hadn't required extensive effort on my part. I expressed my gratitude for his visit and decided to help his niece by braiding her hair into 2 sections. Initially, he hesitated to accept my kind gesture, asserting that business should be conducted professionally without discounts. I insisted that I was simply helping because her hair hadn't needed much attention. Eventually, he agreed to my gesture and left with his niece. Later, my best friend sat me down and shared her suspicion that Raphael might have been seeking an excuse to visit me. I initially dismissed her comments as inappropriate and even felt foolish as I now recount this situation. It's astonishing to me that I found her remarks awkward and improper, yet I ended up contradicting my own stance. Initially, my best friend approached the topic humorously, not taking it too seriously. When I returned home that day, I chose not to share the encounter with my husband. I feared that if my best friend made light of the situation, suggesting that Raphael might be visiting just to see me and using his niece as an excuse, my husband might entertain similar thoughts. I wanted to avoid planting unnecessary doubts in his mind, so I decided to keep the information to myself. After that day, I didn't come across Raphael for nearly a month. Honestly, I even forgot about my best friend's comments. However, when Raphael unexpectedly showed up at the salon again, I couldn't help but begin to grasp what my best friend had implied. On this particular day, he arrived without his niece and specifically asked to see me. Initially, I claimed to be occupied with work due to the many customers in the salon. I thought I could use this excuse to dismiss him since I felt uncomfortable having a private conversation. I told him there were numerous customers and I was swamped with work. To my surprise, he offered to wait until I was less busy. His willingness to wait caught me off guard because I hadn't expected him to be so patient. I assumed he must be busy with his own work and wouldn't have time to spare. However, this was not the case. He had no issues waiting. I decided to deliberately prolong my interactions with other customers, testing whether he would eventually become impatient and leave. But he didn't leave, folks. He stayed until I had finished attending to every customer's hair. My best friend urged me to make a decision, affirming her previous suspicions. She cautioned me to tread cautiously as she sensed that he had ulterior motives. Her words validated the apprehension I had been feeling, confirming that something peculiar was indeed transpiring. Eventually, I approached him and inquired why he had come to the salon. He sensed my discomfort and noted the awkwardness in my inquiry. He apologized for his abrupt visit to my workplace but insisted it was of great importance. I cannot adequately express the level of discomfort and shock I experienced as he stood before me engaging in conversation. My best friend had already sown seeds of doubt in my mind, and I realized that whatever was transpiring in his thoughts couldn't be benign. He confessed that he couldn't stop thinking about me since the party when my husband introduced us. He admitted to actively seeking ways to encounter me again, which led him to inquire until he discovered the location of my salon. Initially, as he began talking, I attempted to cut the conversation short and feigned disinterest. I wanted to give him the opportunity to correct any misunderstanding. However, he remained steadfast in his assertions, displaying unwavering confidence in his words. I felt profoundly uneasy and didn't know how to respond. This marked the first instance since my marriage that another man had spoken to me in such a manner, and the fact that it was my husband's boss heightened my discomfort. I expressed my disapproval, stating that it was inappropriate for him to converse with me in this manner. I mentioned that I intended to ignore his comments and pretend that he had never visited the salon that day as I didn't want to disrespect my husband. Regrettably, it seems that I ended up compromising my principles. Even after my objection, Raphael made no effort to depart. I politely requested him to leave once more, but he declined. I finally compelled him to leave by threatening to contact my husband. He departed promptly, albeit not before leaving me his business card. Despite the surprising turn of events and the surreal nature of the situation, I was well aware that there could be no positive outcome from entertaining Raphael. His infatuation seemed driven by a desire to use me for his own amusement. I had watched countless movies depicting such situations and was determined not to become a victim. Therefore, it pains me even more that I ultimately succumbed despite my efforts to resist. I find it difficult to recount my actions. When I returned home that day, I am fully aware that I will likely face judgment and harsh criticism, and I believe I deserve it. I chose not to divulge what occurred at the salon to Leonard. My decision was primarily based on my recognition that disclosing this incident would arouse his suspicions. I regarded it as profoundly embarrassing and awkward, and I didn't want it to create a hostile work environment for him. That's when I realized that Raphael was well aware that I wouldn't disclose his actions to Leonard because of his position as Leonard's boss at work. He understood that I would strive to protect Leonard's work environment, which explained his confidence. To keep things concise, I'll narrate everything in a more succinct manner. Following the day Raphael revealed his intentions, he became a regular visitor to the salon, coming in weekly with remarkable consistency. Even my best friend noticed this pattern and advised me to discuss it with Leonard, but I chose to remain silent. Perhaps deep down, I secretly enjoyed his frequent visits, a fact that fills me with shame. I opted not to confide in Leonard and continued to entertain these visits, feigning ignorance of the situation. Despite my best friend's repeated warnings, I stubbornly ignored her advice. Raphael didn't just visit empty-handed, he consistently brought gifts and various items with him. I can't explain why or how this arrangement became so routine. Foolishly, less than a month after his consistent visits began, I initiated conversations with him. Since I also worked weekends at the salon, Raphael would visit me during those times when he wasn't at work. During his visits, we'd engage in hours of conversation about various topics. I wasn't even sure what I was doing at that point, but I cannot deny that I actively engaged with him in multiple ways. Several weeks into his visits, he started inviting me to his house, and I regrettably accepted. I never let on that Leonard had noticed anything. I'm deeply ashamed of my actions and can hardly believe how low I had sunk. It was during one of these visits to Raphael's house that things escalated, and that marked the moment when I officially cheated on my husband. As soon as it happened, I regained my senses and hastily left his house. I felt such disgust with myself that I took multiple showers upon returning home. It was as though I had committed an unforgivable act, and to some extent, that's the harsh reality. I cheated on my husband with his own boss, and there's no excuse to justify my actions. I fully accept that I received the consequences I deserved. After the incident at Raphael's house, I refrained from going to the salon for nearly a month. I blocked his number and made every effort to avoid anything connected to him. I even refrained from allowing my husband to touch me for days due to overwhelming guilt. It was a difficult time, but I acknowledge that I brought it upon myself. The guilt I experienced was just the beginning, and the revenge my husband ultimately sought was brutal. I shouldn't have expected anything less. I recognized that I had a wonderful marriage with nothing amiss, yet I kept asking myself why I did what I did. I couldn't pinpoint the reason that led me down this path. I resisted for a long time and had no intention of giving in, but regrettably, I succumbed. Even when he began visiting the salon regularly, I convinced myself it was a temporary diversion, a way to amuse myself. Now I realize it was merely an excuse that led me to cheat on my husband. I gradually gave in without even realizing it. I pretended it was a passing fancy, a form of self-amusement, but it was all a deception. I can't continue to deceive myself and pretend that I didn't understand where it would lead. Why else would I entertain a man who openly admitted to having feelings for me? I'm not naive. I knew he wanted something from me, and I foolishly gave in, jeopardizing my marriage, self-respect, and loyalty in the process. Even as I wallowed in self-guilt and self-pity, I never once considered that my husband was fully aware of the situation. I had no inkling that he knew everything that had been transpiring. In my mind, I believed I was keeping him in the dark, thinking he would only discover the truth when I finally mustered the courage to confess. To be completely candid, if someone were to ask whether I had actually planned on confessing to my husband, I would honestly admit that it never crossed my mind. I was aware that the truth would eventually surface one way or another, but I lacked the bravery to come clean. That's why I firmly believe I deserved the consequences of my actions. I continually lied to his face, pretending that everything was normal. What's even more unsettling is that my husband was well aware of the truth and found out on his own that I had cheated on him with his boss. If you're curious about how he discovered it and how I found out he knew, I'll explain. As I mentioned at the beginning of this narrative, my husband is an exceptionally intelligent individual. Every word of that is true. He possesses keen intelligence and a high level of awareness of his surroundings, making it impossible to hide anything from him. He notices even the tiniest details, and that's how he sensed that something was amiss. Exactly 2 months ago, I was utterly shocked when Leonard did something incredibly audacious. You see, Leonard works as a banker, so it made sense for me to entrust my finances to the bank where he is employed. He also takes care of my taxes and handles all financial matters on my behalf. Essentially, he manages every aspect of my finances due to his profession. When I initially married him, I was quite reckless with my spending. It's not that I had a substantial income, just an average one, but I used to spend recklessly, buying anything that caught my eye. However, after marrying my husband, he began imparting the wisdom of saving to me. He educated me about finances and how to become a more responsible entrepreneur. His guidance was tremendously beneficial, which is why I started entrusting him with most of my tax and savings matters. You may call me foolish, but there were instances when I opted to entrust my money to him just in case I felt tempted to spend it recklessly. I never had concerns because he had his own money, and whenever I genuinely needed it, he would return my money to me. At times, he would even reward me with extra funds when I managed to save a substantial amount. I never fathomed that the mutual trust we shared would ultimately lead to my loss. Then one day, I was hit with an enormous debit. As I mentioned, I run my own business, so a significant portion of my earnings is saved in the bank. My husband is familiar with my PIN, and as I mentioned earlier, he manages most of my financial matters. Occasionally, I would deposit money with him, and it would be stored in his account. On that particular day, my entire savings had vanished. There was virtually nothing left for me, and it felt like I was staring into an abyss. I was at the salon at the time, and I practically dashed out and hurried home. I didn't need anyone to tell me what had transpired with my money. There was only one person who knew my PIN and had control over my finances, and that was my husband. My suspicions proved correct. Upon my return home, he wasn't there, so I had to wait for his arrival. When he finally came back, I confronted him about the disappearance of my money, and that's when I experienced another shocking moment. My husband slapped me forcefully across the face, causing me to stumble back in fear. The intense rage and fury in his eyes sent shivers down my spine, and I can still vividly recall the image of his anger. He shook his head ever so slightly and uttered words that cut through me like a knife, stating that marrying me had been the worst decision of his life. Those words pierced me deeply, and I can't convey the extent of hatred I saw in his eyes. Leonard regarded me with utter disgust. He accused me of being a fool, labeling me as loose and stupid. I was left utterly stunned, unable to utter a single word in response. My shock rendered me speechless, and I knew there was nothing I could say that would make any sense. He went on to reveal that he had been aware of my infidelity for some time now. Yes, folks, he had known about it for a while. He berated me for thinking I could deceive him and get away with it. The level of anger I witnessed in Leonard that day was completely unfamiliar to me. I had never seen him so furious, and I had never imagined he could become so upset. I was equally astonished that he had discovered my affair. He explained how he had suspected something was amiss when I mentioned that his boss had visited my salon. Apparently, he had a strained relationship with his boss, so when he heard that his boss had been to my salon, he grew suspicious. He had secretly hired someone to keep tabs on me, and this person had been providing him with reports of my activities. Even the day I followed Raphael to his house, Leonard had been aware of it. I was flabbergasted and asked him why he hadn't confronted me earlier. He admitted that he preferred to let me remain in the dark, planning to exact his revenge. I questioned why he hadn't intervened before Raphael, and I took our relationship to the next level. Leonard replied that he didn't care what I did. He wanted to know if I would remain loyal to him, and he had his answer. Then he dropped a bombshell, declaring that all the money I had saved with him and the funds in his bank were now his. I couldn't believe my ears. Leonard remained resolute, even as I pleaded with him. I realized that my best friend also had her money in his bank, and I knew she would soon come to claim it. It felt as though the entire world had come to a screeching halt, and I found myself in the midst of sheer chaos. Before I could gather my thoughts, Leonard placed divorce papers on the table. I could clearly see that he had already put his signature on the divorce papers. I felt helpless, acknowledging the consequences of my actions. I pleaded with Leonard to forgive me, expressing deep remorse for everything I had done to hurt him. However, Leonard made it clear that he would never grant me the satisfaction of forgiveness. Adding insult to injury, he demanded that I vacate the house immediately. I had nowhere to go, and I was financially strained, but he showed no concern. Despite enduring a tumultuous day, I mustered the courage to ask about the situation at his workplace. Leonard looked me in the eyes and stated that he wouldn't take any action. He believed I wasn't worth jeopardizing his job. However, I suspected he might be bluffing, knowing he would likely take some form of action. I worried about the impact on his career because men tend to have their pride, and they rarely let such matters slide. I felt immense guilt, and the thought of him losing his job because of me weighed heavily on me. Leonard made it unequivocally clear that I had been a foolish mistake. Those were his parting words before he ushered me out of the house. It has now been 2 months, and I find myself engulfed in self-pity. Surprisingly, Raphael never reached out to me, despite likely hearing about what happened. Rumors spread like wildfire, and I'm certain that the whole city is aware of the truth. It dawned on me that I had unwittingly become a pawn in his game. He had workplace issues with my husband and decided to use me as a means to provoke him. I had been naive enough to fall into the trap and ended up as collateral damage. I eventually signed the divorce papers, and our divorce proceedings are still ongoing. I have no idea how I'll survive the upcoming weeks, but I suppose I'll endure just as I've managed to survive these past 2 months. At this point, I'm at a loss as to what to do next. My guilt is consuming me. I have a court hearing in a few minutes, so I'll conclude this update here. I'll provide another update once the divorce is finalized. Update. I'm now officially divorced. It's hard to believe my marriage didn't even last 3 years. I can't fathom how I allowed myself to be ensnared in all of this. I'm utterly miserable, Reddit. Rest assured, the comments were just as harsh as I anticipated, but I didn't expect anything different. You all lived up to my expectations. Nonetheless, I'm grateful for the comments because they've pushed me to work on myself, even though it's been a challenging journey. The divorce was completed a few days ago, and since we had no children, it was less dramatic. I did receive alimony, although it was reduced to the minimum. I may sound greedy, but what choice do I have? Leonard took every penny that was rightfully mine. I'm now financially strapped, and I owe my best friend a significant amount of money. I attempted to pursue legal action, but lacking the funds for a lawyer, my parents advised me to let it go. My parents are devastated and don't want to speak with me. The only person who's shown any understanding is my best friend. She frequently reminds me of her money and is understandably angry with me, but she's kind enough to let me stay with her. I recently learned that there was quite a bit of drama at Leonard's workplace. Apparently, Leonard had already clashed with his boss. Since his boss doesn't hold a direct ownership stake in the bank and is merely the head of Leonard's department, he couldn't undermine Leonard's career as I had feared. Leonard is still employed at the bank, and that only intensifies my self-pity. Leonard and his boss are making an effort to maintain a professional relationship at work, and things haven't really changed for them. Meanwhile, I'm bearing the brunt of the consequences of the decision made by Raphael and me. The only distinction is that Raphael isn't on the receiving end of all the turmoil. I can't find the words to convey the extent of self-loathing I'm currently experiencing, but I believe I'd be a narcissist if I didn't feel remorse. I despise myself if I didn't feel any regret for my actions. Right now, I'm concentrating on my business so I can repay my best friend. I'll conclude this update, folks. That's the sum of what's been transpiring in my life. I'm thankful that I embarked on this journey and chose to share my story. Thank you all for listening to me.